Okay, we can go ahead and make a prayer. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Illumine our hearts, O Master, who loveth mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our mind to the understanding of thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things as are well pleasing unto thee, for thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God. And unto thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father, who is everlasting, and thine all holy, good, and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, unto ages of ages. Amen. Amen. Well, thank you everyone for being here this morning. We'll continue with our discussion of who do you say that I am? And again, we're using the book by Metropolitan Hilarion, Jesus Christ, His Life and Teaching, Volume 1, the beginning of the Gospel. And we're still in chapter 2, discussing the sources of the information of Jesus Christ, His life and teaching. Last week, we talked about the Gospel of Matthew, and we talked about the Gospel of Matthew being very specifically written for the Jewish Christians who were in Palestine at the time. And he was very heavy in his gospel regarding the teachings of Jesus Christ, particularly things like the Sermon on the Mount, the parables, and things like that. So this week, we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark. And the Gospel of Mark is almost the polar opposite of the Gospel of Matthew. It has very little of the teaching discourses that Jesus presented, but he does a lot of narrative regarding the actions of Jesus, particularly his miracles. So church tradition identifies the author of the second gospel as John Mark. So his full name is John Mark, who was mentioned many times in the book of Acts. According to tradition, Mark was a disciple of the Apostle Peter, which is attested to by the expression, "Mark, my son," which Peter notes in the first epistle, chapter 5. And so Mark retold that which he had heard from Peter. But Mark is also very close to the Apostle Paul as well. And that's testified by the mention of Mark 3 times by the Apostle Paul in his letters. And in the letter to the Colossians, Paul says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, and Mark, the nephew of Barnabas. So we get a little bit more insight into Mark's background. Not only was he a follower of Peter, he was also a follower of Paul, and we know that Barnabas accompanied Paul on much of his missionary work. Mark's also considered to be one of the 70 apostles that were chosen as well. So in being a disciple of both of the chief among the apostles, that is Peter and Paul, of whom only one, Peter, was close disciple of Jesus and also an eyewitness to his deeds, Mark may have based his narrative of events on the stories of the Apostle Peter. So as a result, it's quite plausible that the gospel according to Mark is the version of the good news that came from the Apostle Peter. So eventually, even though Mark accompanied both Peter and Paul, he accompanied Peter the most and was with him in Rome. And we know Peter ended up in Rome at the end of his life and his preaching. The believers in Rome begged Mark not only to preach orally, but also to give them a written account of Christ's life. He agreed and composed his gospel immediately. So just like Matthew, who the Jewish Christians asked to write a gospel for them in Palestine before he left on his missionary journeys, now Mark is asked by the Roman Christians to please write down all these things that you have preached to us. So that's what he did. God revealed to Peter that Mark had written this gospel, and when Peter saw it, he confirmed its truth, and so he approves the written gospel. And then Peter sends Mark as bishop to Egypt. And there Mark preached and established the church in Alexandria, enlightening all those in the sunny land to the south. This was written by this source that I'm using right now is Saint Theophylact of Bulgaria in his explanation of the Gospel of Mark. So he indicates that Mark was sent by Peter to Alexandria to establish the church. This is a Egyptian Coptic icon, and in it we see several things. We see Mark, and that's his name, Mark the Apostle. Alexandria was a seaport, obviously, in Egypt, so that's what we have this ship here bringing him. Alexandria was known to have a very famous lighthouse at the time of Mark's preaching, and so that's what we see here. The lighthouse is no longer there. It was destroyed in an earthquake in the Middle Ages. Here we have a lion, and the reason we have the lion is because that's Mark's symbol as an evangelist, because Mark begins his gospel speaking about John the Baptist, who is the voice of one crying in the wilderness. And that's symbolized by the lion. And then here we have a tree, and I believe this represents the church that was planted in Alexandria at that time. And Alexandria was the second largest city in the Roman Empire, second only to Rome. So this was a very important church that was established, a very important preaching that was initiated there. So we had Rome was the first city, Alexandria was the second city, and Antioch was the third largest city in the Roman Empire at that time. And interestingly, Antioch was sort of the evangelical center from which most of the missionary work originated. So we had Peter, we had Paul, now we have Mark, Barnabas, all left Jerusalem after the initial persecutions of the Christians, went to Antioch, and that became the center of evangelical work. And so from there, the Christian message and the gospel spread to the Roman Empire.
That's why in Acts, they were first called Christians in Antioch. And that's where we really got basis for our archdiocese, the Antiochian archdiocese.
That's correct. That's the home archdiocese, the home see of our church. And yes, prior to in the book of Acts, prior to that time, the Christians were called either Nazarenes or people of the way. And then the disciples were called Christians as followers of Christ in Antioch.
That would forgive my ignorance, I'm just trying to remember. So Mark didn't know Jesus personally.
Well, that's a good question. There is evidence that he may have. And we'll see here in this today that there is evidence that some points in Jesus's life, Mark actually did have contact with him.
So he then had firsthand account and not through Peter, then on some of those.
Some of those, yes, some of his writings in his gospel actually were firsthand. Most of it came from the Apostle Peter, because I believe Mark really wasn't in contact with Jesus until later in his ministry. So the character of this gospel, therefore, is unclouded and clear, containing nothing that is hidden. Mark begins with the prophet and forerunner John, as we said, as the voice of one crying in the wilderness. So that the Gospel of Mark transmits Peter's story of events is borne out first by many references to Peter in the gospel text. Peter is seen as the representative of the group of the disciples. And we see that many times in the gospel accounts. It is to Peter that Jesus often addresses his words that are meant for all of the disciples. Oftentimes, Jesus talks to Peter, but is really speaking to the whole group of the disciples. And then Peter often speaks on behalf of the whole group when he answers. And we see this in this passage in Mark, and I'm going to read it kind of in its entirety, because I think it tells us a lot about Jesus and Peter himself. And so the disciples are talking about Jesus. He's talking with them. First, he asks them, "Who do people say that I am?" And they say, well, that some people say you're Elijah, some people say you're one of the other prophets. And so Jesus says to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And of course, that's the question we're talking about in this session this year. And Peter answers for the group, and he says, "You are the Christ." Now notice in Mark doesn't elaborate the way Matthew does. Matthew says the answer is, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus says to him, "Blessed are you, Peter Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." But notice how Mark just kind of compresses that all, and he just says, "You are the Christ." And Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone who he was. And so again, Mark's gospel is short and quick and to the point. Now, a quick pause here for a moment. Why do you think Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone who he was? Well, the reason is because Jesus did not want people other than his disciples to know that he was the Messiah, because most of the people at that time were expecting a political Messiah. They wanted a political leader, and that would also threaten the established political establishment of the Pharisees and the chief priests. And so Jesus, at this point in his ministry, does not want his messiahship to be known outside of his circle of disciples. When he does announce it publicly is on Palm Sunday, when he enters into Jerusalem in triumph. And that's the first time Jesus publicly pronounces himself as the Messiah. So at this point in the ministry, he wants his disciples to know, but he doesn't want anyone else to know. And so after Peter announces to Jesus that, yes, you are the Christ, Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And Jesus spoke openly about this to his disciples. Now notice he tells them, "I'm the Messiah, yes, but all of this is going to happen to me." Well, Peter, who has just been revealed to him that this man, Jesus, is the Christ, takes Jesus aside, he pulls him aside from the rest of the disciples and begins to rebuke him. And he says to Jesus, "How dare you say this? You're not going to suffer. You're not going to die." And of course, Jesus hears this, and Jesus turns around and he addresses all the disciples, but he says to Peter, he rebukes him, he says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you have the mind of things of, not the mind of things of God, but the things of men." And so in about 5 minutes, Jesus he praises Peter for what he knows that's been revealed to him. He turns around and says, "Get behind me, Satan. You don't know what you're talking about. You're thinking about the ways of men and not of God." Because Satan did not want Christ to be crucified and save the world, because Christ had to die and rise again for the salvation of the world. As we know that from Paul said in his epistle, that's the core of the Christian belief. That's the core of the Christian teaching. And Peter, thinking like men, does not want Jesus to die and rise from the dead. And so Peter goes through this whole situation and then is rebuked by Christ. So in some cases, Peter addresses Jesus, but Jesus's reply is addressed to the whole group. For instance, Peter began to say to Jesus, "Lo, we have left all and have followed you." In this setting here, Jesus is basically telling his disciples that you have to basically give up everything and follow me. This follows the encounter Jesus had with a rich young man who comes up and sincerely asks Jesus, he says, "What should I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Follow all the commandments." He says, "Yes, I've done all that." And Jesus says, "One more thing you have to do, give all that you have to the poor and follow me." And of course, the rich young man, as we know, was very hurt by this. He was grieved because he was attached to his possessions, and he left sad and would not follow Christ. And then Jesus says how hard it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Well, this baffles the apostles. They said to Jesus, "Well, who can enter the kingdom of heaven?" And Christ says specifically, "What's impossible with man is possible with God." And so here we have now Peter answering Christ, and he says, "Well, Lord, we have left everything and have followed you." And Jesus answers him, and he says to the whole group of disciples, "Well, truly I say to you, there is no one here, no man or woman that has left house or brethren or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my sake and the gospel's. In other words, any of you that have left everything, but he shall receive 100-fold now in this life, houses and brethren and sisters and mothers and children and lands with persecutions." So what does he mean by that? And Peter just said, "Well, we just left everything for you." Jesus turns around and he answers him and says, "Well, you've left everything, but you will get 100-fold more of what you just left." What Jesus means by that is, if as an apostle, you will gain many followers, many mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and houses and all these churches that you establish around the world, this will be added to you. So even though you've left everything for me, you will get 100-fold. But he says, with persecutions, you will be persecuted for your apostleship. You will be persecuted for following me. Okay, so that's the price to pay when you take up your cross and follow him. But he doesn't leave it at that, but he says, in the world to come, you will receive eternal life. So you see how Jesus answers Peter, who spoke for the whole group, but but the answer is to all of the disciples. And so finally, Jesus says, but many that are first shall be last, and the last first. In other words, all the chief priests, all the Pharisees, all the leaders who were first among men will be last, but you apostles who are considered nothing, lowly, will be the first in the kingdom of heaven. So any questions about anything up to this point? So it's pretty straightforward. Jesus is talking to the disciples. And of course, St. Mark is presenting all this very concisely, very quickly, and again, from St. Peter's point of view. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus, according to the Gospel of Mark, turns first to Peter and then to all the disciples. Jesus comes and he finds them sleeping, and he says to Peter, Simon, you're sleeping? Sleepest thou? Couldn't you wait and watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit is ready, but the flesh is weak. And what does Jesus mean by don't fall into temptation? Well, the temptation to deny me when you see me on trial, being persecuted, being flogged, and sent to the cross. You're going to be tempted to deny me. Pray and pray that doesn't happen to you, but obviously it does happen, and all the disciples flee, and in fact, Peter denies him 3 times. So again, this is specifically from Peter's point of view that this gospel is being written. Secondly, Mark sometimes speaks not only of Peter's actions, but also of his inner experiences, singling him out from among the other participants of the event. And particularly here, we're talking about the transfiguration. At the transfiguration, the only disciples that were with Jesus were Peter, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee. And they accompany Jesus up on the mountain. He's transfigured. And you can see in the icon here, Peter, James, and John fall to the ground because they're overwhelmed by the divinity that's revealed by Jesus. And Peter says to Jesus, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, and one for Moses, one for Elijah. And so, again, Mark is presenting this event from Peter's point of view. And again, only Peter could have revealed this to Mark because Mark wasn't there. And he knew not what to say, for they were sore afraid. All 3 of them were afraid, but only Peter is the one who is, his reaction is revealed in this gospel. Now, Susie, to answer your question about did Mark know Christ and did he have any interaction with him, there are reasons to suggest that Mark himself was a witness to at least some of the events in the life of Jesus. And specifically here, in particular, Mark is identified by some commentators as the man who brings the pitcher of water and shows to Jesus' disciples the location where the Last Supper is to take place. And we read in Mark's gospel, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, go into the city, and there you will meet a man carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him, and wherever he enters, tell the master of the house, the teacher says, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And so in this case, some of the commentators say that the man with the pitcher of water was actually Mark, who showed the disciples where the Last Supper was to be held. And so here we see Mark, again, late in the ministry of Christ, who is having some interaction with Jesus himself. And so that's why Mark was possibly one of the eyewitnesses to Christ's ministry. In Mark, there's also an example absent in the other Gospels. And here he mentions that at the moment of Jesus' arrest, all Jesus' disciples left him and fled. We see that here. Here are the disciples, and they're taken off. They're fleeing, except for Peter here. He comes and he cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And here we have Judas giving Jesus the betrayal kiss. And then all of these are the soldiers of the Sanhedrin who have come to arrest Jesus. So all the disciples are fleeing. And at this point, I think Peter's also taken off. And a certain young man was following Jesus wearing only a linen tunic, made of cloth at the time. A tunic is basically the main garment. There was a tunic and then there's a mantle, but this man is only wearing a single garment. And the young men, that is the soldiers who have come to arrest Jesus, grab this man and he leaves, he flees, and he loses his garment, he loses his tunic, and he flees from them naked, literally just in his undergarments, and he runs away. The young man's name is not given. However, many interpreters have suggested that this was Mark himself speaking about himself in the third person. So again, we have indications that Mark himself was one of the people around Jesus, particularly at the time of his arrest.
So, Charlie, you told they all fled, but John then is the only one who returned to the cross. He was with the Virgin Mother. Was he also, like Peter, was lingering, but in a distance, after his denial? We don't know if John was there or was John.
John actually was a friend of the high priest's household. So after all of the other disciples left, Peter and John go to the Sanhedrin, to the high priest's house. And since John was known to the household, he was let in. Peter was unknown, and so he was suspected as being a disciple. And that's when he was threatened and he denied Christ 3 times. And then, of course, he left and wept and wept bitterly. But John apparently was able to continue to be near or around Jesus and the women disciples who witnessed the flogging, witnessed the persecution of Christ, and then followed him to Golgotha. So in the end, the Apostle John was the only one who was at the cross from the male disciples. Then obviously the women disciples who had more courage were able to stand at the foot of the cross with the Theotokos and witnessed not only the crucifixion, but participated in the taking down from the cross with Joseph, Mary of Arimathea, and Nicodemus. And then eventually, Saint Mary Magdalene and the Theotokos actually saw where Jesus was laid, the burial tomb, so that they knew where to go the next morning to bring spices and where the resurrection was revealed to them. So as we know, Mark is the shortest gospel. It's very concise. It's the shortest of the 4 gospels. It's distinguished by the special dynamism of the narration. The narration moves right along, and it's very dynamic. Like I said, we don't have a lot of teaching narrative. Often at the beginning of the story, the present tense is used. So, for instance, Mark says, and immediately the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness. I should say, actually, driveth, which is present tense. After Jesus comes out of the water from his baptism, he is driven into the wilderness by the Holy Spirit. And they come into Capernaum, and there cometh a leper to Christ. And they come and say unto him. So you see, all these are present tense, and the multitude cometh together again. And Jesus cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man to him, and they besought him to touch him. And the story continues. As it continues, the present tense goes into the past tense. The reason is Mark wants to put you right in the story. And that's why he uses present tense initially in the story, so that the reader feels like they're right there. This is happening as I'm reading it. Now, sometimes, however, the opposite occurs, where the narrative changes from the past tense to the present. For example, in the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, now Simon's mother-in-law lay sick with a fever, and immediately they tell him about her. This device is used about 150 times in total in his gospel. It adds a liveliness and a directness to the narrative, making the reader feel that he's a participant in the events being described. And speaking of immediately, Mark uses this phrase, and immediately, over and over and over again in his gospel. So things are happening very quickly when Mark is writing this. A new subject is introduced by the phrase kai euthos, which is translated as and immediately. Kai euthos is the Greek for that. So this expression serves many purposes in Mark. In this instance, it doesn't have any chronological weight, sometimes indicating an event that happens much later than the one mentioned in the previous story. So even though he says, and immediately, sometimes this can happen days later. It can be used even within a single narrative to indicate the result of a particular action. As again, we're talking about Peter's mother-in-law, and Jesus came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she ministered unto them. So even in the first chapter alone, the phrase kai euthos, or and immediately, is encountered 11 times in the first chapter. And in total, the word immediately is encountered in the Gospel of Mark more than 40 times, and as many times as in the rest of the New Testament combined. And so it's translated as immediately, straight away, forthwith, at once, and as soon as. So when you start reading the Gospel of Mark, you're going to see this word translated several ways into English over and over and over again.
Probably was it trying to get people's attention, or
that's part of it.
Word immediately.
Yeah, that's part of it, Rob. Bearing in mind who he's speaking to, and these are pagans who have converted into Christianity. So they really know very little about the Jewish history, the Old Testament history, the law of Moses, and things like that. So what Mark wants to do is get their attention right away as to what Jesus is doing, because he's trying to establish Jesus's authority as king of the world. Okay, so he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about what Jesus taught. He spends a lot of time narrating what Jesus did. And so to get their attention, I think you're right. He says things like immediately or at once or straight away, this happened, so that the reader stays engaged. The pagan readers who are now Christians are engaged in what Jesus is doing. And so it's translated, so immediately upon coming up from the water, he saw the heavens torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. That's speaking of Andrew and Peter when they were first called. At once he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat. That's James and John. As they were called, the news about him, that is Jesus, went out immediately everywhere in the entire region of Galilee and the surrounding area. And as soon as they left the synagogue, they came to the house of Simon. So you see how all of these narratives are constructed this way so that the reader basically stays engaged, doesn't get bored, doesn't fall asleep while they're listening to this. And so Mark wants to keep them engaged. Here's a good example of this narrative, type of narrative. And this is the healing of the leper. After Jesus comes down from the Mount, Sermon on the Mount, he is immediately encounters a leper who comes up to Jesus, begging him, kneeling before him, and says to him, if you want to, you can make me clean. Being moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand, touched the man, and said to him, I want to be made clean. And when Jesus said this, the leprosy immediately departed from the leper, and he was made clean. Jesus strictly warned him and sent him out at once, immediately. Euthos. Yeah, Tony.
Yeah, just as a reader, just as a reader, there's this driving force of this. It's something that's not iffy. It's very driving, and as a reader, I get the impression of it's not like Jesus said something and then there was this time in between and then something else happened. It's kind of like watching Die Hard. I mean, there's this driving force that pushes forward. Things are happening and they're not happening in an iffy sort of maybe kind of sense. I mean, it's very much just happening because of it.
Exactly. This, I call this gospel the power and the glory. And you're absolutely right. It's very dynamic, very forward moving, and it keeps the reader engaged. And it really shows, and this goes to my next slide, Jesus shows his authority in the miracles. In Matthew, Jesus teaches these very astounding teachings. And in fact, the crowd says, he taught not like the scribes and Pharisees, but like one who had authority. Okay, so his teaching is brand new, it's authoritative, and now he established his authority by the miracles. And this is what really drives it home for these crowds of people that are following Jesus. Not only does he teach with authority, but now he's a man with authority that is divine in its origin. Okay, and so that's why most of the Gospel of Mark is the dominant element is the narrative. The didactic element, the teaching element that we find in Matthew, it does not find its correlation, its parallels in Mark. For instance, things like the Sermon on the Mount, we really have very little of that. Also absent in Mark are the lengthy dialogues with which Jesus encounters with the Jews. We see that in the Gospel of John quite a bit. In Mark, Jesus only engages with the Jewish leaders, with the Pharisees, when they come to him with questions, with bewilderment, and with accusations. They come to him and they say, why do you do this? Why do your disciples do that? They don't follow our tradition. And Jesus answers them fairly quickly and very succinctly, but he doesn't engage with them quite a bit. The parables do not occupy such an important place in Mark as in Matthew and Luke. The Gospel of Mark contains only 5 parables out of a total of about 25 or 30 in Matthew and in Luke. The emphasis is primarily placed on the miracles, to which a significant part of the narrative is devoted right up until the story of the Passion. And again, as you were saying, Tony, it's really a driven narrative to get us to the climax, which is the Passion of the Christ. It is widely viewed that the main audience of the Gospel of Mark, as we said, consisted of Christians who had converted from paganism. This is supported by the fact that the question of the mutual relationship between the Old and the New Testament, which Matthew talks about quite a bit, Mark only talks about from time to time. His readers really aren't that interested in the Old Testament because they are not from a Jewish background. Although, having said that, the Gospel of Mark does contain numerous references to the Old Testament, but only as it pertains to what Christ is doing. Now, Mark uses quite a few what they call Aramaisms or Aramaic phrases. It is only in Mark that Jesus calls his disciple, the James and John, the Aramaic phrase Boangeres, that is the sons of thunder, and that's actually translated Banai Rajis, or sons of thunder. And Jesus' words are addressed to the 12-year-old girl, are quoted in Aramaic, Talitha Kumi. Kumi, by the way, is arise. Where else do we hear that similar phrase? Qum, Qam, Messiah Qam. It's the same thing as we say, Christ is risen. Qam, Qumi, same root there, which literally means arise. However, the Aramaic words in Mark are always accompanied by a translation. So when you're reading Mark, Jesus takes her by the hand and says, Talitha Kumi, and then parentheses, little girl arise. So Mark always translates the Aramaic words into, at that time, the Greek, because the readers wouldn't know what Talitha Kumi means. However, in Matthew, if he uses an Aramaic word, he doesn't translate it because he knows that his readers know what those Aramaic words are because they're used to them. They've heard them. Same thing with the word korban. And again, Matthew uses it, he doesn't translate it. Mark uses it, and he translated it as a gift. That means a gift. So, korban, gift, translated. And then finally, one of the other examples when Jesus is healing the deaf mute, Jesus uses the word eftaha, and then he says, parentheses, be open. So he always translates the Aramaic into the vernacular. When Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's praying, he says, Abba, and then parentheses, Father. So they're always, whenever he uses an Aramaic word, he uses the translation. Now, one of the reasons Mark inserts Aramaic words is to add greater liveliness to the narrative. And it's also possible that since he was an eyewitness, as we said, to some of the events described and the kernel of what occurred, this was impressed in his memory. So when Mark is listening, he's also recounting some of the things he heard by Jesus, his own voice. He recalled the voice of Jesus, his words, the original way they sounded, and he wanted to preserve them precisely in the form in which they were uttered. For us, these details are precious. We hear the voice of Jesus speaking in his own native tongue. So when Mark does his narrative, it's almost like he's hearing Jesus saying these words, and he wants to write it down exactly as he heard it.
He reminds me, and I've never thought of this before, but truly as a journalist in his day,
Yes,
that he knows his audience and he made sure he's understood by the audience by translation or not referring to things they wouldn't know, but referring to what's going on. And the fact that you said he didn't belabor anything, he didn't over describe, he was very direct in his accounting, and it's like a journalist should be.
yes, exactly, Susie. And he's giving us that account, as you said, as a journalist who wants his readers to be there, to hear it, to feel it
Current tense.
in the present
Say
tense.
all the time, so it's not so old, but the news isn't old, but it's now.
Yes, exactly. And speaking to that, so he's writing for people in Rome. Now he's going to Alexandria, and he's preaching brand new gospel to the Egyptians. And so again, he wants to put them in the moment. And so he writes this gospel, and he takes this gospel with him to, obviously, to Alexandria as well.
I'm reminded too of one other thing, always during Lent and Holy Father emphasizes that you are there. This is now. Even though Jesus was crucified, went for his passion, was crucified 2,000 years ago. He wants us to go through all those days and all those services and all those events of Jesus's life. And putting us there. Remember, I'm always emphasizing that.
And that's a good point you just bring up. The Gospel of Mark in our liturgical cycle is read during Lent. So that's a good point, Susie. So it's even more probable that the individual Aramaic words and expressions uttered by Jesus resounded in a lively manner in Peter's stories. And so again, Peter is also recounting these things that he heard as well. Now, one final thing, there are several Latinisms encountered in Mark, and that's because we understand that it was written for the Roman church in the first century, who the Romans actually spoke Latin in Italy in the first century. And so when they spoke Latin. And so the Gospel of Mark includes a few Latinisms like the words quadrans and praetorian. And those were words that the Romans would understand that are not understandable from other populations. So finally, in conclusion, as St. Gregory, the theologian, had said, Matthew wrote for the Hebrews, Mark for Italy. Next week, we'll talk about the Gospel of Luke, who wrote for the Greeks. And finally, the Apostle John, the great preacher ascending to heaven, who wrote for all of us, for all of the populations and the people that would hear it. So next week, stay tuned for the Gospel of Luke. Any other questions or comments? Anybody still awake? All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. See you next week. Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
My favorite gospel.
Is it?
Thanks, everyone.
Be in church.
Yeah, see you guys. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you, Charlie.
You're welcome. Thank you, Ruth. Take care.
Thanks.